Tay stood frozen in the living room, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Her mother-in-law, Mrs. Johnson, was shouting, her hand slamming down on the polished wooden table with a force that made Tay flinch. "Pay up or leave this family. Your choice." Mrs. Johnson's voice echoed through the spacious room, sharp and unforgiving. Tay's mind raced. She could feel the heat rising to her cheeks, a mix of shock, anger, and embarrassment twisting inside her. She loved her husband, David, more than anything, but this was different. This was humiliation, plain and simple. All around her, the house seemed to grow colder, as if the walls themselves were judging her. David stood a few steps behind her, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. He didn't say a word, didn't move, just stared at the floor. Tay could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to support her, she knew that, but he was trapped too, caught between his mother's rage and his loyalty to his wife. Tay's stomach knotted. She had worked hard for everything she had, every penny saved. She had always been careful with money, responsible, and proud of the small successes she had carved out for herself. But nothing she had done seemed to matter here. Nothing could protect her from Mrs. Johnson's relentless demands. Her hands trembled at her sides. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. Her mother-in-law's sharp eyes bored into her, expecting a response that would satisfy her fury. Tay felt every bit of herself shrinking under the weight of those expectations, wondering if love was ever supposed to feel this heavy. She glanced at David again. His silence felt both comforting and terrifying. He wasn't helping, yet he wasn't condemning her either. It was a fragile balance, and she worried it could tip at any moment. Tay wanted to tell him that she was scared, that she felt trapped, but she also wanted to protect him from this storm, from his mother's judgment. The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating. Tay could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the wall, the sound of her own heartbeat booming in her ears. She knew that this wasn't just about money. It was about control, about power, about proving who was in charge. And in this house, she was the outsider. Tay drew a shaky breath and tried to steady herself. She remembered why she had married David, the moments of laughter, the quiet evenings together, the feeling of being safe in his arms. She reminded herself that love could sometimes survive storms like this, but the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of her resolve. Mrs. Johnson's glare didn't soften. Her fingers tapped impatiently on the table. Tay felt a mix of humiliation and anger swell inside her. She hated that she was afraid, hated that she felt cornered, hated that the woman who was supposed to be family could make her feel so powerless. And yet, through it all, a small spark of determination flickered. She would have to decide, give in or stand her ground. Her eyes met David's again, silently asking him for support, for understanding, for some sign that they could face this together. And for the first time, Tay realized that this moment, terrifying as it was, might also be the one that defined her. If she could find the courage to make her choice. Tay grew up in a small apartment with her mother, who worked long hours to make ends meet. Her childhood wasn't easy, but it taught her two things above all else: the value of hard work and the importance of family. She learned to be responsible, to care for others, and to stand up for herself when needed. Money was always tight, so she developed a habit of saving, planning, and thinking carefully about every decision. Even as she became a nurse, working long shifts at the hospital, she never forgot the sacrifices her mother had made. Family loyalty was not just a value for Tay. It was a promise she carried in her heart. David, on the other hand, grew up in a very different world. He had comfort, privilege, and a mother who believed she had the right to control everything in his life. David loved his mother, but he also felt trapped by her rules. He wanted to be independent, to make his own decisions, but fear of disappointing her often held him back. He learned early on that appeasing his mother was easier than standing up to her, even if it meant ignoring his own needs. His passive-aggressive habits were small, almost invisible, but they often showed in subtle ways: hesitations, unspoken frustrations, and choices that avoided confrontation but left resentment simmering. Mrs. Johnson, David's mother, was a force of nature. She ran her household and family finances with absolute control. She believed she knew what was best for everyone, and expected obedience without question. She was proud, domineering, and manipulative when it suited her. Financial control was her tool, and she used it freely to assert power. For her, family hierarchy was sacred, and anyone who challenged it, even slightly, was met with anger and criticism. The Johnson home was beautiful, elegant, and polished, but it hid tension under its perfect surface. Large windows let in sunlight that gleamed on the shiny floors, and tasteful furniture filled the rooms. But behind this image of perfection, there were unspoken rules, silent battles, and subtle manipulations. Tay often felt the chill of disapproval even in the warmest rooms, and David's hesitation and quiet defensiveness only reinforced her anxiety. Tay worried about money constantly. She had always been independent, and the thought of depending on someone else, especially her mother-in-law, made her uncomfortable. Every gift, every comment, every suggestion from Mrs. Johnson seemed like a test, a reminder that Tay didn't belong. She worked long hours at the hospital, saved her earnings, and even chipped away at debts quietly, all while trying to maintain peace in the household. But the tension never fully disappeared. David's passive-aggressive tendencies often made matters worse. He rarely spoke up when Mrs. Johnson crossed a line, leaving Tay to absorb the brunt of criticism. Sometimes he would side with his mother, sometimes he would remain silent, and other times he would make excuses for her behavior. Tay loved him deeply, but the constant micro-conflicts made her question whether love alone was enough to survive this household. There were moments in the past when tensions flared. Small arguments about money, choices, or boundaries became silent wars. Tay learned to navigate them carefully, avoiding direct confrontation, but always feeling the pressure to prove herself. She wondered if she was strong enough to withstand her mother-in-law's dominance, and whether David could ever see the unfairness of it all. Approval mattered in this house. Mrs. Johnson's approval was like a gatekeeper, deciding whether Tay was worthy or not. Every interaction carried weight, every decision could be criticized. Tay felt the sting of disapproval acutely, not just because of her pride, but because it touched the very core of her identity. She wanted to be respected, to be seen as an equal partner in her marriage, not just a guest in someone else's family. Despite the tension, Tay tried to find balance. She cherished the moments of love with David, quiet evenings after work, shared jokes, and small acts of kindness. Those moments reminded her why she had married him, why she endured the constant tests, and why she hoped for a life where both love and respect could coexist. But the stakes were high. Her sense of self-worth, the stability of her marriage, and the possibility of long-term resentment all hung in the balance. Every small conflict mattered because it was a piece of a bigger puzzle, a test of whether Tay could maintain her dignity while navigating a family that measured love and obedience. She knew that one misstep could change everything. And deep down, she worried about how much longer she could keep holding herself together in a house where control and manipulation were as constant as the air she breathed. Tay was strong, compassionate, and loyal, but she also carried fear and doubt, the shadows of a life that had demanded resilience from the very start. David loved her, but his inability to stand fully with her left cracks in their bond. Mrs. Johnson wielded power like a weapon, keeping everyone on edge. And in the midst of this delicate balance, Tay's quiet strength began to prepare her for a confrontation she could no longer avoid. She knew it was coming, even if she didn't yet know how it would change her life. Tay was in the kitchen, quietly stacking bills she had been paying off from her own savings. She had done it secretly, not because she wanted praise, but because she wanted to help the family without causing a scene. Every month, she set aside money from her paycheck to slowly clear an old debt that had been hanging over the household for years. She thought no one would notice, and she could quietly protect her husband and the family from stress. But no secret lasts forever. That evening, Mrs. Johnson stormed into the kitchen, her face red with anger. Her eyes burned with fury as she slammed a hand on the counter. "So you've been doing this behind my back? Paying debts that don't concern you," she shouted, her voice echoing through the house. Tay's chest tightened. I just wanted to help," Tay started, her voice trembling. "Help? Or think you know better than me?" Mrs. Johnson snapped, stepping closer. "You've betrayed this family, Tay. You've disrespected me, and now you're acting like you're in charge. Do you know what kind of incompetence this is?" Tay felt the blood rush to her face. Shame and anger collided inside her. She wanted to explain, to defend herself, but the words sounded weak even in her own ears. She had only tried to help, only tried to ease the burden. And now she was being accused of betrayal. David appeared in the doorway, hesitating, unsure how to step in. "Mom, please, let's just calm down and talk about this," he said softly. "No, David. She needs to learn her place," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice cold and sharp. "This is not a suggestion. It's a lesson." Tay's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Fear prickled at her skin, but beneath it, a stubborn spark of defiance grew. She realized that her mother-in-law had been testing her since the beginning. Every small argument, every disagreement, every subtle insult. And now this felt like the final test, the ultimate ultimatum. "I am not betraying anyone," Tay said, finally finding her voice. "I'm paying what I can to help this family, just like I always have. I'm not trying to disrespect you. But I won't let you make me feel worthless for trying to do the right thing." Mrs. Johnson's eyes narrowed. "The right thing? The right thing is knowing your place. You don't get to decide what's best. You're not in charge here." David sighed, running a hand over his face. "Mom, please, this isn't helping. Tay is just she's trying to help." But his words fell flat. Mrs. Johnson turned to him sharply. "Trying to help? You're defending her? You're siding with her against me? Don't forget who raised you, David." Tay felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. She loved David, but he couldn't fight this battle for her. She was alone in this storm, standing in the kitchen with her heart racing, knowing that any wrong move could escalate things further. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. Tay's mind raced with fear and frustration. She had done something good, something responsible, and yet she was being punished. Anger bubbled inside her, hot and consuming, but so did the fear of losing everything she had worked for. Her marriage, her sense of dignity, her place in this family. "I am not your enemy," she said, her voice steadier now. "I've been trying to protect this family, and I won't be made to feel ashamed for that." Mrs. Johnson scoffed. "Protect? You think you can protect anyone? You're just a child playing at responsibility. You need to remember your place before it's too late." Tay swallowed hard, feeling trapped. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape this control, but she couldn't leave David, not yet. She realized that standing her ground would come at a cost, but for the first time, she felt a strange sense of clarity. She couldn't let fear dictate her actions anymore. The confrontation ended with Mrs. Johnson storming out of the kitchen, leaving Tay and David in silence. David looked at her, guilt and confusion in his eyes, but Tay no longer waited for his validation. She knew now that this was her fight, her test, and the only way forward was to face it head-on. Tay leaned against the counter, taking deep, shaky breaths. The fear was still there, gnawing at her, but so was the fire. She was trapped in this moment, yes, but she also knew that this was the moment where she could finally choose herself, or continue to be trapped in someone else's rules forever. Tay felt the weight of the house pressing down on her more every day. Since the confrontation in the kitchen, everything had changed. Mrs. Johnson seemed to watch her constantly, her sharp eyes catching every small mistake, and turning it into proof of Tay's incompetence. She would whisper to David about Tay's spending, her long hours at the hospital, or the way she cooked dinner. Every small detail became a weapon in Mrs. Johnson's hands. David, caught in the middle, tried to stay neutral, but Tay could see the subtle ways he started to question her. He would sigh when she suggested paying a bill or planning a schedule, and sometimes he would repeat his mother's words without realizing it. At work, Tay's colleagues noticed she seemed tense and distracted. She had always been cheerful and reliable, but lately she arrived exhausted, her mind half on the hospital floor and half at home, wondering what Mrs. Johnson would say next. Even simple tasks felt heavy. She sometimes forgot minor details in patient charts or hesitated when administering medication, not because she was careless, but because her thoughts were tangled in fear and self-doubt. Her friends, sensing her anxiety, called or texted to check on her, but she often brushed them off, too ashamed to admit how trapped she felt. One evening, as she sat in her small apartment she occasionally used to escape, her phone rang. It was her sister Layla. "Tay, are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but concerned. "I'm fine," Tay replied quickly, forcing a laugh. "No, you're not. I can hear it in your voice. What's going on with your mother-in-law? I remember this from when we were kids. How controlling she could be. She's testing you just like always. You have to stand your ground." Tay felt a lump form in her throat. Her sister's words reminded her of the long patterns of control and subtle emotional abuse she had seen in David's family before marrying him. She realized she wasn't imagining it. This was real, and it was affecting her life every single day. But confronting it wasn't easy. Mrs. Johnson had begun raising the stakes. One morning, she called Tay into the study, her expression tight with authority. "You know, Tay, the family business assets aren't given freely. If you can't contribute financially in the way I expect, perhaps you should reconsider your place here." The threat of eviction hung in the air like a dark cloud. Tay's stomach twisted. She had always worked hard, and the thought of losing even partial control over her life was terrifying. The days blended into weeks, each one filled with silent battles. David's passivity added to her frustration. He would nod along to his mother's criticisms, trying to avoid conflict, but that silence often felt like betrayal. Tay began questioning herself. Was she being too sensitive, too proud? Or was this truly manipulation? She struggled with the thought of leaving David. Could she walk away from her marriage? Or would that feel like abandoning him? Abandoning her responsibilities? Even abandoning love itself? Arguments started to happen more often. Small comments over dinner would erupt into tense discussions. One night, David suggested she should maybe consider listening more to Mrs. Johnson, and Tay's temper finally flared. "Listening more? Do you even hear yourself? She's controlling everything I do, David. Everything. And you just sit there." David didn't respond immediately, just looked down at his plate, his jaw tight. Silence stretched for minutes, heavy and uncomfortable. Tay began keeping secret records of household finances and her contributions. She paid certain bills without telling anyone, trying to maintain some control over her own life. She would sometimes work late, returning home to find Mrs. Johnson glaring, saying things like, "So this is how you prioritize your time?" Tay clenched her fists, refusing to respond, but inside she burned with anger. She was tired of being made to feel like her efforts were invisible, unappreciated, or wrong. One evening, after another tense dinner where Mrs. Johnson had criticized the way she had organized groceries, Tay sat alone in the kitchen and let the tears fall. She felt completely alone, carrying the weight of her choices, her marriage, and her dignity. She thought about leaving David, moving out entirely, starting over somewhere new. But the thought brought guilt as quickly as relief. Was walking away betraying the love they shared? Or was it the only way to reclaim herself? Over time, Tay noticed subtle shifts in her own mindset. She stopped waiting for David to act, stopped hoping someone else would defend her. She began speaking up in small ways, calmly correcting misinformation about bills, or reminding Mrs. Johnson of facts she couldn't twist. She started setting boundaries in quiet ways, like closing her bedroom door when she needed privacy or politely refusing to discuss finances she had no control over. Each small act gave her a tiny spark of courage. Even when David remained passive, Tay felt a new strength growing inside her. She realized that she could no longer rely on anyone else to validate her efforts. She had to trust herself, her instincts, and her sense of right and wrong. Every tense scene, the arguments, the silent treatments, the manipulations, and the threats, was teaching her something important. That empowerment wasn't about winning over her mother-in-law or even changing David. It was about standing firm, refusing to let fear dictate her life, and learning to act with dignity and clarity even in the hardest moments. One afternoon, she returned from the hospital to find Mrs. Johnson waiting with her usual cold stare. Instead of shrinking or apologizing, Tay met her eyes directly. "I have done everything I can to help this family. I will continue to help where I can, but I will not let fear or threats control me," she said, her voice steady. Mrs. Johnson frowned but didn't speak. David looked at Tay with surprise and a flicker of admiration. For the first time, Tay felt the sense of control that had been slipping through her fingers begin to return, just a little. Even though the tension didn't disappear, Tay could feel a shift inside herself. She was still afraid, still trapped in a web of manipulation and expectation, but now she was learning how to navigate it. Each small victory, speaking up, setting boundaries, refusing to be silent, built her courage. She could feel herself changing, growing stronger, and more determined to protect her dignity and her life, no matter what her mother-in-law tried to do. Tay knew the storm wasn't over. There would be more arguments, more silent treatments, more tests of her patience and resolve. But for the first time, she wasn't waiting to be saved. She was ready to stand firm. And deep down, she knew this rising tension, as painful as it was shaping her into someone who could face whatever came next. She could feel her courage growing, slowly but surely, and it gave her hope that she might finally claim the life and the respect she deserved. Tay was going through some bills one evening when something made her freeze. There were several loan statements in David's handwriting, loans she hadn't known about. Her stomach sank as she read through the details. David had secretly taken out loans in his mother's favor, putting their home at serious risk. The money wasn't for anything necessary, it was just to appease Mrs. Johnson, to show loyalty to her, and it was costing them everything. Her hands shook as she stared at the papers. All the secret payments she had made, all the careful planning she had done to keep their lives stable, it all felt like it had been for nothing. Anger, disbelief, and fear collided inside her. She realized that Mrs. Johnson had not only been testing her but had been using David as a pawn, manipulating him behind the scenes, while he, blinded by years of passivity, had gone along with it. That evening, Tay knew she could no longer stay silent. The next family dinner was planned at the Johnson house, and she decided this was the moment to confront them both. She spent hours preparing herself, going over every detail in her mind. She couldn't let fear control her anymore. She had to reclaim her dignity and make David see the truth. When the evening arrived, the dining room was quiet, the table set beautifully, the air tense with the usual undercurrent of control. Mrs. Johnson smiled politely as if nothing had happened, while David looked uneasy, sensing the storm that was coming. Tay took a deep breath and began speaking. "I want to talk about something important," she said calmly, placing the stack of loan statements and financial documents on the table. "David, I found these loans you took out in your mother's favor. Do you know what this means? You risked our home without telling me, without asking me, without even considering the consequences for our family." David's face turned pale. "Tay, he started, but she held up a hand. "No, let me finish," she said firmly. "This isn't just about the loans. It's about everything that's been happening in this house. Every time your mother has tested me, every time she's made me feel small or useless, you've let it happen. And now, you've crossed a line that affects both of us. This stops now." Mrs. Johnson's smile faltered. "Tay, you're being dramatic. I only want what's best for this family." "Best for this family?" Tay's voice rose with controlled anger. "Do you call manipulation, threats, and hiding financial decisions the best for this family? You've controlled me, humiliated me, and used David as a tool to get what you want. And you, David, you let it happen. You've been silent for too long, and now I'm done paying for your games." David's hands trembled as he tried to respond, but Tay continued, her voice steady and strong. "I've tried to help quietly, to keep this family safe, to pay debts responsibly. But I am not paying another cent for someone else's manipulation. I will not be shamed for doing the right thing. I will not be silenced any longer." The room was tense, every person frozen. Mrs. Johnson's lips pressed into a thin line. David looked like he had just been awakened from a long, confusing sleep. Tay could see the recognition slowly dawning in his eyes. The realization that he had been manipulated, that his loyalty to his mother had come at a cost he hadn't fully understood. You never told me," David whispered, his voice shaky. "I didn't realize. I didn't know how far this went." Tay nodded. "Exactly. And that's the problem. This is not just about money. It's about trust, respect, and control. I cannot continue living like this, hiding everything just to keep the peace. I've tried. Eva endured. And now I choose myself." Mrs. Johnson's face turned red with anger, but Tay didn't flinch. "You've made it clear, Tay," she said, voice cold. "But remember, you're still part of this family. We'll see how long your courage lasts." "I'm not afraid anymore," Tay said, her eyes locked on Mrs. Johnson's. "I will not let fear dictate my life. I will protect myself, my home, and my marriage, but not at the expense of my dignity." David finally spoke, his voice firm, though still uncertain. "Mom, I think I see it now. I see how much I've let you control everything. I've been blind, but not anymore." The shock in Mrs. Johnson's eyes was mirrored by Tay's quiet satisfaction. She had not shouted, not stormed out, not begged for validation. She had stood tall, calmly revealing the truth, letting the evidence speak for itself. Her moral strength and emotional courage had created a shift that nothing else could have achieved. For the first time, Tay felt a sense of relief, mingled with pride. She had confronted not just her mother-in-law, but also the fear and guilt that had been weighing her down for months. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but she also knew she was no longer a passive participant in her own life. She had reclaimed her voice, her power, and her dignity. That night, Tay went to bed with a feeling she hadn't had in a long time: freedom. Not the freedom to escape, but the freedom to stand her ground, to protect herself, and to live without being manipulated. She would no longer pay for someone else's control. She would no longer shrink to fit into someone else's expectations. She had chosen herself, and that choice, though difficult, felt like victory. The confrontation had changed everything. David now saw the truth. Mrs. Johnson's grip was shaken, and Tay had finally taken the stand she had been preparing for months. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew this. She would no longer be a prisoner of fear or manipulation. For the first time in years, Tay felt strong, clear, and ready to face whatever came next. After the big confrontation, Tay knew she needed space to think and take back control of her life. She moved into a small apartment nearby. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. For the first time in months, she felt calm and safe, able to make decisions without fear or pressure. She set clear boundaries with her family, letting them know what she would and would not accept. David realized he needed help to break free from his mother's control. He started therapy to understand his codependency, and to learn how to stand up for himself and for Tay. Slowly, he began confronting his mother privately, setting limits and speaking honestly. Mrs. Johnson didn't like losing control, but she still kept some dignity, so the tension between them remained real, yet manageable. Tay reconnected with friends she had pulled away from during the stressful months. Talking to them, laughing, and sharing support reminded her she wasn't alone. She also focused on her financial independence, carefully planning her expenses, saving, and making small investments. Each small step gave her confidence and a sense of freedom she hadn't felt before. Life wasn't perfect, but Tay felt stronger and more in control. She was learning to balance love and care for her family with respect for herself. Every boundary she set, every decision she made for her own well-being, felt like a small victory. The relief was bittersweet, but it reminded her that she could live with dignity, make her own choices, and still maintain relationships on her terms. Tay had started rebuilding her life, emotionally, financially, and personally. She had regained self-respect and independence, and for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face the future with courage and confidence. Tay sat quietly, thinking about everything she had been through. She realized she had grown stronger, and could love her husband and family, without losing herself. Smiling softly, she whispered, "I chose myself, and that was the hardest but most freeing choice I ever made." She felt calm, proud, and free.